October Skype session. We have Skype sessions every other month. Our next Skype session will be in December, and boy, we try to have it on the fourth Thursday of every month. But boy, in December, that's going to be December 26th. And I don't think we'll have it then. So we will probably have it December 19th, and I'll be sending out a Survey Monkey to elicit any topics that you may want to discuss. But for this session, I want to specifically thank Holly Wagner from Rowan Cabarrus for suggesting Nancy Ausherman to present on today's topic. And today's topic is Interpreting 101. Now, Nancy also presented at Disabilities in a Day conference that we had this past year, and it was so well received that we wanted to have her back. A little bit about Nancy. She's an Assistant Director of Disability Support Services at East Carolina University. She is nationally certified sign language interpreter with a registry of interpreters for the deaf, as well as hold a full license with the North Carolina Interpreter, Transliterator, and Licensing Board. Nancy has worked in a variety of settings, including North Carolina vocational rehabilitation, secondary education, freelance interpreting, and now in higher education. She teaches American Sign Language classes and coordinates interpreters for any classes, programs, or events held at ECU. Nancy was the Eastern Region representative for the North Carolina Register for Interpreters for the Deaf from June 2015 to June 2017. Nancy frequently hosts programs in the community to educate others and brings awareness to deaf culture and of ASL. So at this time, I would like to introduce Nancy Ausherman. So Nancy, take it away.
Thank you, Trudy. I appreciate it, and I appreciate this opportunity for this presentation today. I'm just going to dive right in. Hopefully everyone can see the slides that are put up here. And if we'll go to the second slide, which says, why hire an interpreter? Interesting that just this morning I got an email from a school of the university here across town that was asking this very question about why to hire an interpreter. And I pulled this information from the ADA section or subpart C regarding auxiliary aids and services. So in highlight in yellow there it says no individual with a disability is excluded, denied services, segregated, or otherwise treated differently than other individuals because of the absence of auxiliary aids and services. So what is an auxiliary aid or service? If we go to slide 3, we see that a qualified interpreter on site or through video remote interpreting, VRI, services, note takers, real-time computer-aided transcription services, written materials, exchange of written notes, skip down, closed captioning, including real-time captioning. So depending on the situation, depending on your student or client that you're providing the services for, will determine what auxiliary aids are necessary. So not every person that identifies as being deaf or hard of hearing uses sign language. And so a sign language interpreter is not always the most appropriate accommodation. However, when it is, we need to make sure that we make every effort to provide that service for either our student or the individual that we're providing the services for. We'll go to the next slide. It states here to know what is appropriate, what's an appropriate accommodation. So the type of auxiliary aid or service necessary to ensure effective communication will vary in accordance with the method of communication used by the individual. The nature, the length, the complexity of the communication involved, and the context in which the communication is taking place. So, depending on what the student's preference is. So, within the role of sign language interpreters, there are also different types of sign language. So, American Sign Language is a language with its own grammar, its own structure, its own syntax. It's been passed down from generation to generation. It meets all the requirements of a modern language. As a matter of fact, in 2008, the North Carolina General Assembly recognized American Sign Language as a modern language in the state of North Carolina, and now high school students can take American Sign Language to suffice foreign language requirements for graduation. And some of the 16 universities within our system will accept American Sign Language for entrance requirements. East Carolina University is one of those. So American Sign Language is a language in itself with a different grammar, different syntax than English. Now there's variations of sign language. There are different forms of manual communication. Signing exact English is something that was developed years ago by hearing educators of the deaf. And what they did is they took American Sign Language signs and applied it to English word order. And an individual that uses signing exact English, they have a different mode of communication compared to someone that is a strong American Sign Language user. So you want to make sure that the interpreter that you're providing is qualified to interpret effectively for the individual that's needing the service. Also on this page it says the nature, the length, and the complexity of the communication involved. If a student just stops by your office and has a quick question and didn't have an appointment, you had no way of knowing that they were coming by and just pops in, you may not have an interpreter readily available in your office. In that case, you could write back and forth with the student. You may use your computer, just pull up a Word document and type back and forth. Or you could even use your cell phones and put it in text messaging and text back and forth. Something that's going to be quick and brief may not require a sign language interpreter or a certified CART provider per se if it's a brief encounter and the complexity is mild. However, if a student requests a meeting and it's to discuss their academic standing, it's to discuss their career goals, it's to discuss their course schedule for the fall, I would recommend having an interpreter for an encounter such as that to make sure that the student is able to get equal access to all information as well as be able to express their own needs. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. So on this slide, we're talking about providing accommodation. So a public accommodation should consult with individuals with disabilities whenever possible to determine what type of auxiliary aids are needed to ensure effective communication. So again, when you have a student that is a manual communication user, so they sign, you want to talk with them and find out what type of interpreting services do they need. Do they use American Sign Language or do they prefer signed English? There's also a mode of communication known as cued speech, which not a lot of deaf and hard of hearing individuals use it, but there are a few in the state of North Carolina that still use this mode of communication. I had a student graduate probably about 3 or 4 years ago that was their primary mode of communication. Cued speech is not a language. It is a lip reading aid that was developed to assist deaf and hard of hearing individuals in lip reading. So it's based on phonetics, it's several hand shapes, and placements around the mouth and chin area. And someone that is skilled in translating with this is called a cued speech transliterator. There are not many of them available in the state of North Carolina. And as I just mentioned, I had a student a few years back who graduated from ECU who used a cued speech transliterator for their 4 years while they were here, and I had to recruit that person to drive here every day from Wake Forest to Greenville. So sometimes their primary mode of communication may be something that's difficult to come by or difficult to access. I'll talk in a little bit about different ways that we can overcome some of those obstacles and barriers, but it's important that we make sure that the accommodation we're providing is what's appropriate for the individual using it. In addition, so I have someone maybe who's hard of hearing who does not sign or is not fluent in sign language enough to rely solely on a sign language interpreter. They may use an assisted listening device in the classroom. So an ALD or an assisted listening device is basically a microphone that the instructor will clip on to their lapel, and then the student will use headphones or earbuds with a receiver so that they can hear directly the instructor's voice. Also, students that are hard of hearing that aren't fluent in American Sign Language or another signing system may prefer a speech-to-text service. So CART, which is Communication Access Real-Time Translation, that's an individual that's basically trained as a court stenographer, and they provide a word-for-word, verbatim, real-time transcript in the classroom for the student to follow along. So this individual can be present in the classroom with the student, and the student can either look on their computer screen or they can sit separately and they can connect via a split screen, and the student can read verbatim everything that's being said in the classroom. Everything the instructor says, the comments that other classmates make, and it's possible to also save that transcript and have it to refer to for notes later. This can be done either face-to-face in the classroom or it can be done remotely. So an individual can be in the classroom, they can log on and connect with the CART provider via Google Chat, Skype, various ways. You just need to make sure that there's a good microphone in the classroom connected to the student's computer so that the auditory input will be good enough that the transcriptionist can hear it remotely and to provide an accurate transcript. There are other transcription services aside from CART. Again, CART is a court stenographer, and they provide a word-for-word, verbatim account of everything that's said in the classroom, including a time stamp for everything that's said. Some other transcription services are known as CPrint and Typewell. They're more what we call computer-aided note-taking. These often are summarizing information that's being said in the classroom, and again, this can be done simultaneously, face-to-face in the classroom with the student, or they can be done remotely. And this is, again, a summary. However, a very qualified CPrint captionist or Typewell captionist can give you almost verbatim of what's being said. You just don't have the time stamp, and you also have more page breaks, so more spacing in the actual transcript when you look at it and read it. Maybe a little bit easier on the eyes for the individual that's reading the transcript. Excuse me. So talking with your student and finding out what their preferred mode of communication is will determine what type of accommodation you're going to provide, whether it's a face-to-face classroom experience or if it's distance education. I have more and more students contacting us that are enrolled in distance education courses. Often they enroll in the course thinking that the course will be text-based and get into it and realize that there's an audio component to the class and they can't access the information because they can't hear it. I've done a variety of things to accommodate students in online classes. We had a student from Tennessee that was taking a course here at ECU online, and they were deaf and preferred sign language interpreting. So to accommodate that particular student, I actually videoed myself interpreting the audio portion of the online course. So the instructor had posted lectures online with a split screen with his PowerPoint showing on one side, and then you could see the instructor on the other side of the screen. He talked through the PowerPoint slides as if he was in a classroom giving a presentation, and so I used an iPad and filmed myself interpreting that information and then sent it to the student in Tennessee. That was their preferred mode of communication. On the flip side of that, I have a lot of students right now that I'm currently providing services for that we use either CPrint or CART. Depending on the student's preference and needs dictates which of those services I'll provide. Also, the amount of complexity to accessing the information may dictate which of those services I provide as well. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So this slide is just to give you an idea of why we don't have cookie cutter approach to accommodations. One size does not fit all. So looking at the audiogram, if you look at the top, so from the bottom going up to the top, it shows the decibels of sound. And then horizontally from left to right, we see the hertz or the pitch. So from low frequency to high frequency. Most of us have a hearing loss somewhere between 5 to 15, maybe to 20 decibels is within the normal range. And on the right side of that audiogram, you can see normal, mild, moderate, severe, and profound. So depending on where an individual's hearing loss falls will determine what sounds they're able to hear, if they're able to pick up speech and communication sounds. Excuse me. In the middle, you see that yellow shape. It looks like a banana. That's actually called the speech banana. And that's where the majority of our speech sounds fall. So if someone has a moderate to severe hearing loss, they're not going to hear a lot of speech sounds. So in a classroom, understanding an instructor may be very difficult for them. In addition, when an instructor turns around, writes on the board, and continues to speak with their back turned, it's even more difficult because you can't see their mouth, you can't read their lips. So making sure that this person has access to the appropriate accommodation in the classroom is going to be important. And again, we go down to severe and profound. So where someone falls on this audiogram will show us medically where they fit, if they're either hard of hearing or deaf, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how they identify themselves. I've known individuals that had a severe to profound hearing loss, but they considered themselves hard of hearing. The reason for that is they do not rely on sign language interpreters. They don't communicate using manual communication. They prefer to lip read and to speak for themselves. So that person may be clinically deaf, but culturally they consider themselves hard of hearing. And then I've known people that had maybe a moderate to severe hearing loss, but they consider themselves deaf because maybe they have other deaf members in their family. They may have deaf friends that they associate with. They prefer to use American Sign Language as their mode of communication, and they rely on sign language interpreters for any type of business or education. So again, it's important to understand where someone may fall on this scale and how they identify themselves. And that may help you to understand why they're requesting a specific service as opposed to another. Trudy, do you want me to stop and answer some of these questions now, or do you want me to hold the questions till the end?
Go ahead as we progress. Go ahead and answer so that we're in contact. So that I know Holly's already answered CART, but if you could go ahead and spell out the names for the other caption services that you've suggested, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. So again, the CART, the abbreviation CART for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. C-print is the letter C with a dash and then the word print, P-R-I-N-T. This is a service that was originated out of Rochester Institute of Technology. They have the National Technical Institute for the Deaf as one of the colleges at RIT, and they developed this speech-to-text transcription service. So it's based on phonetics. An individual is trained to type, basically summarizing the information that they hear. So similar to a sign language interpreter, so I'm a trained sign language interpreter, and when I'm interpreting in a classroom, I listen to what the professor says, I process that information myself, understand it, and then I put it out in another language or another format. So a C-print captionist will do something similar. They'll listen to the information, they process it, and then they put it out maybe in a summarized form, as opposed to a CART provider will give a verbatim, word-for-word account of what was said. And as I mentioned, the CART provider also gives a time stamp. So it's a very, very detailed transcript with very little spacing, you know, just verbatim, word for word. So if someone were CART transcribing what I'm saying right now, unfortunately I happen to say the word a lot. So every time I say that would be included in the transcript. Where with a C-print captionist, they would eliminate the ums and the uhs, and if I repeat myself, they may not include that repetition in the transcript. It's more of a summary of what's being stated. Typewell is another transcription service. I don't have as much information on Typewell. I actually did C-print training myself, so I'm very familiar with C-print and CART because I have a CART provider that I have used for the entire 13 years I've been here at East Carolina University, so I'm very familiar with CART and C-print. I'm not as knowledgeable about Typewell, but it's my understanding it's very similar to C-print. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, so are there any questions regarding the audiogram and talking about how a deaf person may identify or the types of services that they may request as opposed to you know, one service over another? I don't see anything right now listed on the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on to what is a qualified interpreter, the next slide. So the ADA states that we need to provide a qualified interpreter. So according to the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, a sign language interpreter is someone who can interpret in sign language effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using any necessary specialized vocabulary. So A sign language interpreter needs to be someone that has been trained in both receptive and expressive skills. So if you have a deaf student in a classroom and the interpreter is signing everything that everyone else is saying, and the deaf person wants to respond and wants to participate in the class, that interpreter should be qualified and trained enough that they can accurately translate or interpret what the deaf person is saying to the rest of the class. This is a difficult task. Probably one of the most difficult tasks for a sign language interpreter is this reverse interpreting, where you're voicing for the student. American Sign Language is completely different than English. A student that uses American Sign Language as their sole form of communication, the word order, the structure, the grammar is completely different. There are nuances, facial expressions, body movements that have meaning, that if you're not accurately trained, it's easy to misinterpret some of this information. So as a sign language interpreter, it is very difficult sometimes to accurately voice for a deaf person and make sure that you're accurately conveying their information. So you want to make sure that who you hire is qualified and capable of providing both the expressive and the receptive interpretation for your students, so that, again, they have equal access to all programs and services. So to work as an interpreter in the state of North Carolina, you have to be licensed by the North Carolina Interpreter, Transliterator, and Licensing Board. The only exception to this is educational interpreting. Now, I say that with this caveat. When the North Carolina Interpreter, Transliterator, Licensing Board, NCITLB, was established, negotiations were in place, and the Department of Public Instruction was on board until the midnight hour when this licensing law was signed. The reason the DPI, the Department of Public Instruction, withdrew from licensure was because at that time they did not feel confident that their sign language interpreters that were employed in the public schools would be able to meet the requirements to become licensed. And at that time, they could not risk losing the majority of their sign language interpreters that were employed across the state. So they opted out of the licensure law and want to govern their own interpreters. With that being said, when they withdrew, the verbiage that was included in the NCITLB law said educational interpreting. It should have said secondary education interpreting, so K through 12. Unfortunately, because of how it's worded, educational interpreting can mean higher ed. And so legally, universities and colleges do not have to hire a licensed sign language interpreter to interpret for students in the classroom. However, I strongly encourage them to do so, because if someone is not licensed, they don't have a governing body that oversees them. So if we skip to the next slide, number 8. Excuse me. This slide gives us just a little bit of background and information about why the NCITLB was set up and how it was set up. If we'll skip to the next slide, number 9. So this says, the practice of manual or oral interpreting and transliterating services affects the public health, safety, and welfare, and therefore the licensure of these practices is necessary to ensure minimum standards of competency and to provide the public with safe and accurate manual or oral interpreting or transliterating services. So the impact that a sign language interpreter has on an individual can be significant. When the interpreter is the mediator between a hearing and a deaf person, people trust that that person knows what they're doing and that they're accurately conveying their information. So in a classroom, an instructor trusts that an interpreter sitting in the chair interpreting to their deaf student is accurately conveying all the information that that instructor is giving the class, and expect that that deaf person should have equal access to that, and therefore their work, their test grades, their projects, everything that they turn in should be reflective of their having received equal access to all the information. If an interpreter is not accurately conveying that information, it puts the deaf student behind the eight ball. It is not providing them equal access to programs and services. I've had situations where I had a deaf student transfer from a community college to the university, and the interpreter that was used at their community college was not certified. They were not licensed. They were not what I would call otherwise qualified. However, they interpreted 2 years or more for this student at a community college, and when the student came here, they were woefully unprepared. In addition to that, during the first test that this student took, they asked the interpreter for answers to questions on the exam because that's what their previous interpreter had provided for them. That is absolutely inappropriate. An interpreter should never provide their own thoughts, opinions, provide information, provide answers to a deaf student. They should only be there to provide communication access between the instructor and the student, and from the student to the instructor. For a student to be given information by an interpreter is deplorable. And the problem is when you hire someone that is not licensed or certified, there's no governing body over them. So with the NCITLB, it is a licensing body that you have to go through training and credentialing in order to become licensed. If we skip to the next slide, actually the statistics there just show the number of interpreters, licensed interpreters in the state of North Carolina. This is as of June of this year. So originally there were only 188 interpreters in the whole state that were licensed back in 2004. And 126 of those were grandfathered in. Currently, of those number grandfathered, there's only 42 left. There are currently 348 fully licensed interpreters across the state. There are 150 provisional license. Now, a provisional license means that this individual possibly has gone through an interpreter training program, but has not passed a national certification exam. The national certification exam currently is through the RID, which is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. There was a moratorium on that exam for a period of time. There was some issues with the exam, so there's kind of a backlog right now in the state with provisional interpreters that are trying to take and pass that exam. And so some provisional interpreters, their provisional license has been extended until RID can get the testing situation cleared up. But between the grandfather, the fully licensed, and the provisional, we have a total of 540 licensed interpreters in the state of North Carolina. We'll skip to number 11. So back to what I was saying, for a licensed interpreter to become licensed in the state of North Carolina through the NCITLB, they have to meet certain standards, including demonstrating sign proficiency, having a certain number of education hours, and years of experience. They have to adhere to a code of professional conduct that's set forth by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID. So the situation that I explained where a student came from a smaller school that had an interpreter that was not certified, and that interpreter provided information and answers to the student that was not appropriate. if they were licensed, the interpreter could file a complaint against them. The student could file a complaint against them. The school could possibly file a complaint against them through NCITLB, and that person's license could be revoked. So as a licensed interpreter, the NCITLB is our governing body that watches over us and makes sure that we're adhering to our code of professional standards, that we are doing no harm to our clients that we're working with, and that we're providing accurate and appropriate services. So another interpreter can report an interpreter to the NCITLB, or a client, a student, a deaf person, a patient that's being interpreted for can report misbehavior to the NCITLB, and that interpreter can be investigated, and if they're found to be in wrongdoing, their license can be revoked. Okay, and then slide 12, how do I find a qualified interpreter? So the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and I believe, Dr. Evans, you have that link that you're able to pull up, is that correct? Are we able to pull up that link?
In just a second.
Okay, thank you.
Not a problem. Whoop.
Okay, so the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. So on their website, you can get lots of information as well as locate a sign language interpreter. So if you look under, let me see. In the middle, if you click on the arrows that are scrolling from different pictures, if you click to Interpreters for the Deaf, there's a picture of Governor Easley, yes. And click on Learn More. So there's a sign language directory, information about how to become a sign language interpreter, contract information for those that are already interpreters, want to work with the state, and then resources for interpreters. So sign language interpreter directory, view sign language interpreter and transliterator directory, you can click on that. And it's broken down by regions. So I'm in the Eastern region, or actually it's listed under here as Wilson area, licensed interpreter directory at the very bottom. And it breaks it down by city. So if I was looking for someone in Greenville, I have a list of interpreters there. It also shows you their certification, which for a lot of you that may not mean a whole lot, the CI, CT, NAD4. It's a breakdown of what their credentials are. So CI is a certificate of interpretation. CT is a certificate of transliteration. And then the NAD4 was the National Association of the Deaf. They had a license or a certification exam that they used to administer as well. But now the NAD and RID have merged to develop one test. But as you can see, if you scroll down through here, it gives you a breakdown of these interpreters, how to contact them. This is a very useful resource if you're looking to hire an interpreter on your own. However, if your community college requires you to have an approved vendor and to go through a vendor vetting process. I know at ECU, I used to have individual contracts with interpreters. I currently go through an agency. So I have one agency that is a vendor that we use, and I contact the agency and they locate interpreters for me. Now their fees are higher, of course, because they have a coordination fee, but you can do either. You can hire an interpreter directly or you can hire through an agency. When disasters strike, when there's important information, this website often will post information like video vlogs for the deaf community so that they can find out what's going on. They can have real-time information. Also, on this website, should you need assistance, so if you have a student that maybe needs additional assistance that you're not able to provide, that they need an advocate for something, or they come to you and tell you that they were discriminated at a doctor's office, or they went to purchase something and, you know, the people ripped them off and they just didn't know what to do. If they needed resources, or if someone calls your college or university and is asking about resources and you don't know where to refer them to, the Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing have regional offices. And if we go back to the home page for them, let me find where on here. I'm sorry, hold on. Let me look and see where it's listed on their web page. Okay, let me search it up top. Okay, so if you go to the search at the top of the home page and type in regional centers, and then click on Regional Centers for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, it breaks down the regional centers by region. And again, these individuals can provide amazing services and information if you have questions about, I mean, especially at a community college, you're going to have a variety of people, variety ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, all the way from remedial courses and reading and GEDs all the way up to technical programs. So you may have students that come through that have needs that you're not able to provide. So having access to the regional resource centers, making a contact with their staff, and being able to refer your students to them can be extremely helpful. They can also come onto your campus and provide workshops, training, information. They do equipment distribution programs for people if they need hearing aids, if they need assistive devices, various products and services that deaf and hard of hearing individuals may be eligible for. They also work with deaf-blind individuals. So just a wealth of resources that are available through your regional resource centers of the Division for the Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So you might want to, you know, bookmark that page, and if you ever have an issue or a need, you could contact them. They're a great resource to have close by. So they have a list of interpreters. They have a list of their regional offices. And I'm not sure if they have a list of interpreter referral agencies, but that's something the regional centers could provide you as well. So if you need interpreters and you want to go through an agency and you're not sure what agencies are near you in your area, the regional center could put you in contact with credible interpreter referral agencies in your area. With that being said, I also want to add this, that In recent years, a lot of out-of-state language provision companies have gotten into providing American Sign Language interpreting. So I know myself as an interpreter, they contact me often asking me to work for them, and they may contact me about specific jobs and things like that. So a lot of interpreting through agencies like that is done remotely. So it may be a video remote interpreting, whether it be for a doctor's appointment or if it's a classroom setting. If you don't have access to an interpreter in your area, if you're in a rural location with very few resources and you don't have access to a live body, a sign language interpreter, you may go through a remote interpreting agency. And I recently checked with the NCITLB to confirm. So if someone is working in another state like Florida or Texas, but they're working through a video remote company and you hire them to interpret a class for a deaf student, so the student has their laptop in class, they open it up, they Skype in with the interpreter, they have a microphone set up so the interpreter can hear what's being said in the classroom, and the student can watch the interpreter on the screen, and they may interpret the class without physically being there. So someone that is not physically in the state of North Carolina does not necessarily have to meet the licensure requirements. Okay, so this can be good and bad. It's good in that if you need someone and you have access to a video remote service, you can provide it almost anywhere you have internet connection. The negative to it is, again, you know, you're not real sure what you're getting from an outside agency unless it's a credible agency that maybe you've vetted and you've talked with them and find out what their hiring practices are. You know, I would ask questions like, you know, do you hire certified interpreters? Does your state have a licensure law? How do you match a interpreter with a student or with a client to make sure that it's a good fit and that the understanding and comprehension between the two is, you know, appropriate. So there are options if you don't have access to interpreters in your area. Remote interpreting and remote captioning are a wonderful new technology that we have access to and can really be beneficial when you don't have access to someone close by. All right, so we've only got a few minutes left. I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. Our last slide there, I've completed the PowerPoint presentation. Are there additional questions that I can answer? Trudy, was there anything in particular you wanted me to address that I didn't go over?
Nancy, I think you've covered a lot of the main points that I was hoping that you would cover. So, and you had them within your slides. So, we'll keep it open for some questions for people.
Okay, a couple of things I did want to add. I had an experience earlier this week where I interpreted for a student with their professor, and the professor had never worked with a deaf student before and continued to refer to me as opposed to the student. They did not make eye contact with the student. They kept saying, tell her that I said this, tell her this, as opposed to speaking directly to the student. So just some, you know, courtesy, protocol, you know, educating people that when you have a deaf person and an interpreter, you want to look directly at the deaf person and talk with them. You want to address them by name. The interpreter really is there just to facilitate that communication between the deaf and the hearing individual. So, you know, also making sure that if the deaf person is someone who can read lips and may even speak for themselves, that they have a good line of sight when you're talking with them, that there's nothing obstructing their view from you, that there's not like a bright light behind you and your face is shaded, but they want to be able to look at you, see your facial expression, your body language, so that they can, you know, pick up on those nuances and participate in that communication as much as possible. So, you know, just a little bit of education sometimes to our faculty and staff about when you're communicating with a deaf and hard of hearing individual, you just want to speak directly to them and not address them through the interpreter, if that makes sense.
Nancy, also if you're on the phone, to unmute your phone, just hit *6 and you can ask the questions for Nancy at this time. Any questions? Again, I want to thank Holly Wagner for recommending Nancy Ausherman. And Nancy, thank you so much for your time. Your information is so important for all of our disability service staff at community colleges. And this information is critical and vital and very informative. So I appreciate your support. If anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoints sent to you, just email me and I will have a copy of that, and I'm very happy to send that out. Again, thank you for attending today's Skype, and again, thank you so much for Nancy Ausherman for presenting on Interpreting 101. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Trudy. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
All right.